Hey, everybody, and welcome to another How to Succeed podcast, the show that helps you get to the top and stay there. This is how to succeed at matching your sales process with the modern buyer journey. The following podcast is copyrighted by Sandler Systems, LLC, and protected by U.S. copyright laws. Sandler is the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training. You can subscribe to this podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts or find any additional resources from Sandler at sandler.com. I'm your host, Mike Montague, Director of Community Engagement at Sandler, and my guest this week is David Fisher. He's a longtime award-winning Sandler trainer from Manhattan, and we're going to talk with him about how to succeed at matching your sales process to the buyer journey. David, welcome back to the podcast. Tell me a little bit about the difference kind of between your sales process and the buyer's journey.
Sure thing. And thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me on. Always great to be on again. I think that, a couple of things to think about, right, is we've advanced through technology, and now a lot of people are selling virtually, and just the tremendous amount of access that people have to information. The entire selling process has really evolved. But one thing I do think has remained pretty constant is that when you think about it, if we're doing this right, sales is something that we should be doing with our buyer. And what oftentimes happens, right, is that it's something that we wind up doing to our buyer, meaning we give them a lot of information, we give them demos. It's really one-sided. For those of you listening that are perhaps maybe newer to sales, it may feel like the other side of it, which is sales is something that your buyer is doing to you. And I think it's really important that we have to match both our process with the way that people typically buy. So I'm glad to be talking about this topic today.
Yeah, and it's one that we've tried to talk about a lot more recently. So I think by the time this airs, we'll have a new book out called How to Sell to the Modern Buyer by David Mattson and 52 Sandler Rules updated for the modern buyer journey. And I think that's probably a good place to start. Is maybe I think people have this historical misconception of what salespeople should be and what they should do. So when we start talking about attitudes, what do you think? You already kind of mentioned something, doing it with them, but what are some ideal attitudes or things to keep in mind? And then what are some maybe common misconceptions or places where people mess this up?
Sure. Well, I think probably one of the things to keep in mind, right, is that, and I don't want to be extreme here, but when I do a lot of training sessions with clients, especially early on in the relationship, one of the things I ask is, if you were to poll all of your prospective clients and clients, how many of them truly know how to buy what you sell? And the answer that I get is oftentimes they don't. And on the sales side of things, we're just conditioned to believe that, well, they're the buyer, they have the money. Early on in the dynamic, right? They do have the power. And so we may concede the fact that, well, they probably know what they're doing. So I think that from a mindset standpoint, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that more often than not, or chances are that the person you're talking to or the people that you're talking to don't truly know how to buy what you sell.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because even when there are professional buyers and decision-making teams, if you're in enterprise selling, they don't really do these processes that often for your product or service compared to how many times you do it. I think that's the big part of it. And then they don't know kind of what they don't know. So they're doing what they think is best. Everybody walks around doing what they think is best, right?
Totally.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the customer is always right. And so how do we maintain equal business stature, but also work with them? And I think this is the subject of our podcast today: align with them, but not take over their process so that they feel like it wasn't their decision, and not completely be subservient in their process. That's a fine balance, right? How do we find that gray area in the middle?
Absolutely. And I think that another mindset to keep in mind as a selling professional, right, is that your role once you are interacting with a prospect, whether it's a brand new prospect, whether it's an existing client where you're looking to upsell them. You have to think about, my role in this is to help you, the buyer, make the best informed decision possible. And so to your point, it should be a give and take, and in understanding where they're at in the journey, and recognizing that you have the expertise, that you've helped people make this decision, and then from there determining where are their gaps, so that ultimately at the end of it, the buyer can say with great confidence, I went through the necessary steps so that I can make, or that I have been able to make, the best informed decision possible. And I think this is the toughest part for salespeople to understand, is the back end of that, right? Whether or not to go with my solution. Sometimes the process may end with them going with a competitor. Sometimes it may end with them making no decision at all. Again, the key here is it the best informed decision for the buyer?
And let's talk about that informed part a little bit before we move on, because I feel like in the modern buyer journey, and we talk a lot about this in the book, that prospects generally are more educated. They can Google and get answers to facts. But if there's a salesperson involved, the chances are it's because it's expensive, it's difficult, it's a confusing process to figure out anyway. And I think salespeople need to remember that that's what their role is for. Their role is not really to educate the buyer, because they can do that themselves now on the internet. Your role is really to make sense of that information that they find and help them become, I guess, not necessarily more informed, but more savvy with their analysis of the data that they find. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I heard someone put it best. They said that, we've gone from the days of educating to now our job is to help curate, right? So they have all this information. Okay, well, how do we help them take that information and put it together in a way that's going to help best align with their solution, or what they at least perceive the solution to be?
Now, as we move to behavior here, I think this is really where this topic gets sticky. Is you have a set of steps, they have a set of steps, they may or may not align, or there may be more steps on their side or less or more on yours, and it gets really messy. So what is really our goal, plan, and action items for aligning with the buyer journey?
Well, on the heels of that mindset, right, that chances are people don't know how to buy what you sell. And the caveat to that, of course, is that nobody will tell you that. But let's just pretend for a moment, and we'll have some fun here. And Mike, I know you've done a lot of selling in your day. So I want you to tell me how many times you've heard this on a sales call. All right, an initial sales call. Person gets on, says, hey, Mike, let me just start off and let you know that I have no clue whatsoever how to buy sales training. And quite honestly, if I don't make a good decision, I'm going to get in some pretty hot water here, and my reputation is on the line. So please, Mike, would you help me? Would you help me make the right decision? How often has that happened to you?
Yeah, I can't think of one. There may have been somebody who said, we don't know what we're doing, we need your help, but not about buying the sales training. Yeah.
Okay. And so I think that, to take that to a behavioral standpoint, if you can just pretend for a moment that if you heard that question, and whatever it is that you're selling, right? The equivalent of, I've never made this decision before. This is a pretty important decision for my organization. If we don't do it well, you can insert whatever bad things will happen. What are the steps that I would need to go through so that I can say to my leadership that I made the best informed decision possible? Now, on the seller's end of that, if you can't answer that question, then that takes us into the behavior to think about, which is known as sales templating. Sales templating, it's essentially saying, what are the steps? And it could be a variety of different things. A lot of companies will do a 15-minute intro call. They'll call it discovery. From there, if that goes well, they'll move into a demo. There may be another step where they get into some more proof of concept. They may do some ROI analysis. But as selling professionals, if we cannot articulate what that process is, then we run the risk of defaulting then to our buyer's process, which oftentimes is a non-process. And I'll tell a quick story of also thinking that this behavior through as far as refining it. Now, I have a client I started working with about 4 months ago. They're in managed IT services. And when he started looking at all the deals that closed, one of the things that he noticed is that when he did a site visit as part of his sales process, his closing percentage went through the roof. So we had a discussion and said, okay, well, why not make that part of your process? After you have an initial call, the next step is for you to go in and do a site visit. And so he was able to adjust his process. Now, it's not to say that the buyer will follow that, and that's really the give and take, but the behavior should be coming up with a sales template, coming up with a step-by-step process, figuring out, is this the best for my buyer, refining it. But when you have that process, it's going to be much, much easier to get your buyer to follow it as opposed to defaulting to theirs.
Yeah, I think defaulting is the word that I was going to bring up there, because what we found is if salespeople don't know where they're going, you default to following whatever the buyer wants, and they may not have a process. So they're defaulting to whatever they did last time or whatever they think would be best. But if you can lay out like a well-lit path or a recommended path and say, hey, you can go any direction you want. But typically I found that our clients have great success by doing an on-site demo or a mini pre-qualification meeting or a deeper discovery at this point. When you can lay out those steps of what you would recommend next, then it at least changes the default. So if they don't have anything better, or they don't have a strong opinion of, well, my boss definitely wants to see an on-site demo with our custom specs in it, then you go, okay, well, we can do that. But if they don't have something better, then they're going to default to where you would like them to go and what is best in yours. And I think that takes me to my next question, which I wanted to, throw a curveball at you, which is, when I've taught this class before, it's a fine line. Sometimes people paint in extra steps to their process that they don't need. And so we see this a lot with like contractors where they're like, I'm sure you're going to go get 3 more bids, but that might not be in your best interest as the seller. So I think really getting clear on these steps of how do you not slow the sales cycle down, but control it and keep it as short and effective as possible. That's a tough balance, right?
Totally. And then if you add on the layer of like, as you know, Mike, we're really big with DISC at Sandler. If you have somebody that's a high D, they want to make decisions quickly. And in fact, Susan Villamino, who's part of my franchise, we always have this discussion is that she is very quick. However, if the salesperson that she's talking to has a well-defined process, she will acquiesce to it as long as it makes sense. So I think that, we have to have that fine balance for sure.
I want to share a story there because we had this Heidi neighbor friend of mine. She was the vice president and acting president of a hospital here, a big hospital in Kansas City. And they were building on a new wing. And the salesperson asked if she was going to put it out for bid. And she said, are you crazy? We're building 100 beds. They rent for $1,000. They go for $1,000 a day. If I take 7 days to make this decision, it costs us $700,000. There's no way anybody else is going to come in less than $1 million off of the bids we already have and the people that we already know and trust. We're making a decision. We're moving.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of mentality is completely different than those C personalities. They're like, we need to check everybody, look at all the specs. We're going to do 1,000-line RFP with scopes, and then we're going to test all of this stuff. And I found that amazing, and that mindset amazing, that people do buy like that. And so you do have to be flexible, even if you know what your default template is.
Absolutely.
So let's, anything else there? I'll give you one more shot at behavior. Are there any goals here or specific action items, or maybe it takes us into technique of how we actually set this up, or any recommended ways to kind of have that conversation around aligning our process with theirs?
Well, I think, just on the heels of kind of goals, right? If we look at where this falls short, oftentimes, and I think the most frustrating thing for sales professionals, for sales leaders, is when your sales process ends way sooner than your buyer's decision process. So a lot of times for salespeople, it ends with we're sending them over some type of a proposal or it's an agreement. But once you've given that up, the only thing you have left now is this perpetual pinging. So I think the goal of having a really good sales process and matching it up with your buyer's process is that when your sales process ends, their decision process ends within a relatively short time frame. It's not to say that they will give you a yes, but I think the biggest disservice in sales is that we have this, how many opportunities out there are just in this zone of non-decision. So I think that's a key goal for everybody when you're thinking about your sales process. Does it end when your buyer's decision process ends or close enough to it?
I think that's brilliant. I have never heard anybody put it that way before, but you're right. And the Sandler system goes all the way through post-sale and in advocacy on their side of how are we handing them off to customer service, how we're making sure we're getting referrals and repeat business from it. And I think that way, if you plan all the way through the process and following through afterwards, it just makes a ton of difference between you and the competition. Because like you said, most people go, all right, we got the check. Let me get the heck out of here and get you off to customer service as fast as possible and move on. It really destroys a lot of trust and relationships there. And I love what you said too. When you run out of ideas, you get into that follow-up mode and you're just like, all right, well, anything else? And it's like a conversation that's gone stale there.
Right. Yeah.
So
just checking in, Mike. Just checking in, Mike.
Just bumping this to the top. Let's talk a little bit about technique here a little bit. Any specific questions, phrases, tools that you like to use to make sure that we keep things moving?
I'm gonna share three, and you touched on one of them. But the first one, surprise, surprise, right? This is a Sandler podcast, upfront contracts. But I want to take this just one step further. Many of you out there that know Sandler, that are clients of Sandler, that have used Sandler, I'd say that out of all the techniques, it's definitely the most popular. And many people know the micro upfront contract. And what I mean by that is that's the thing that you outline at the beginning of a meeting. That's where you talk about time, what you're going to talk about, agendas, outcomes. What I want to have you think about is the macro upfront contract, meaning where you actually outline the entire process to your buyer at the beginning of the sale. And I want to share a quick story. I have a client that I've been working with now for about 5 years. He has a wealth management practice, and he really took to the upfront contract and the macro upfront contract. And what he started doing is he started putting his client journey into all of his literature on his website, so that whenever somebody looked him up, they saw all the steps that they needed to go through to potentially become a client. And of course, along the way, he was also really articulate in saying where the off ramps are, meaning if you get the sense this isn't a fit, here's where we can end the discussion. So I think the first technique is to think about how do you discuss the macro upfront contract. Mike, would it be okay if I shared with you the steps that people typically go through to make a decision like this? All right. And then you can walk them through the steps. So I would say that's the first technique. The other is the sorting questions. And Mike Crandall, longtime Sandler trainer, in Oklahoma, he one time he did this talk. He said, "Amateurs sell, professionals sort." It stayed with me, and I think that it applies here. In early on in the process, we have to sort buyers in understanding, have they made this buying decision before? And you could pose that out, Mike. To what extent have you purchased sales training in the past? Or you could ask it presumptively, when you've purchased sales training, or when you've worked with a wealth advisor in the past, what did that look like? Once you find out if the person has made this decision before or not, now you have a way to ask those follow-up questions. And then the third technique I would say is using, which you touched on, right? Using third-party stories to insert parts of your process that they may not be thinking of. So, common thing that I hear is they want to bring in a sales training company, and have a good conversation. They talk about objectives, what they want to accomplish, and the conversation always goes to content, and they want to understand content. And so the question I always pose is, how do you plan to evaluate the person that will actually be delivering the training to your people? And oftentimes I haven't thought about that. Well, can I make a suggestion? A lot of times if you want to fast forward, whoever you bring in, ultimately what will happen is you will have a sales trainer in front of your salespeople. Wouldn't it be good to have a good feel for their style, for how they connect with your people well in advance of that? No, it's a great point. So as a suggestion, we recommend that our clients come check out a session before they make the decision as to whether or not to move forward with us. And so you can use the third-party story as a way to nurture somebody over to your process. And of course, we know that our best chance to win, right, is to have somebody see us in action. So yeah, I think the lesson for people out there is, are there parts of your process that could give you a competitive edge that your buyer isn't thinking of that you could have them partake in? Again, in the goal of helping them make the best informed decision possible.
I love that you brought up qualification there at the beginning and the off ramps, because I think when so many people think about their sales process, they think of that old visual of the funnel. And in a funnel, everything you put in the top goes out the bottom at some point in an actual funnel. But that's not the way sales works. Sales has off ramps, like you mentioned, or places where we need to make decisions to go out. And I think that's a cool part of aligning your sales process with theirs is at some point, I'm going to need to make a decision of who I pursue and whether this is a good deal for us and we can solve your problem. And so I need to have a couple of points in my sales process, probably a mini qualification up front, probably something before I do a whole bunch of work on a demo or a presentation or proposal, and then probably something at the end before we actually confirm the deal. And I think the buyers probably have the same thing, but nobody's ever asked them before. I think the buyer's default is all of our, solutions could get to the final stage and then we'll tell everybody no at the same time, because they don't want to tell people no and then try to bring them back in later or something. So if you don't watch out for those steps, you can end up doing a lot of work that doesn't end up getting you paid, and it just muddies up your funnel and your CRM and everything else. So great points there. Anything else you want to mention before we wrap up? Final thoughts here on aligning your sales process with the buyer journey?
I think it's also just important to recognize, right? And David Sandler mentioned this, that as salespeople, we have rights. We have rights in the process. So if you get a sense when you learn of somebody's process that it just doesn't match with yours, and I think about this in the RFP world, right? How many times do you get the RFP? It's like, well, here's what we want. Nope, you can't talk to us. We won't get on the phone with you. No questions. And then you have salespeople that say, all right, great, I'll pursue that one. Versus saying, okay, well, we'll respectfully decline. For us, we find that these situations work out best when we have an opportunity to speak live with somebody. And if somebody is not willing to go along with your process, I think it's totally fine to say, I respect that. This just isn't going to be a good fit.
I think that's definitely a great move. And there's more situations than you would think like that. Most sales managers and salespeople, when they hear that for the first time, they go, I want them pursuing every deal. And then you got to think about it. Well, there's some that are reverse bid process, like in shipping and logistics, where the person that has the absolute lowest price wins. And that's a race to the bottom. That's not fun. There are other ones where they just want to get a quote to keep their current vendor honest, and they're wasting your time, and they'll even tell you that up front. And you're like, well, I suppose we could do that, but why? How much are you going to pay us to do this negotiating for you on your behalf? And a lot of other squirrely things that happen along the way. So I appreciate you bringing them up today. That's David Fisher. He's a longtime Sandler trainer from Manhattan, and you've been on the podcast before. We've asked you a lot of bio questions. So I think I'll just maybe keep it simple for you today and ask you, what is maybe a perfect sales process for you? You've hinted at some of them, but just for you personally, what does it look like when it's the ideal situation?
So ideal situation is that you have an opportunity to have just a quick intro discussion, 15, 20 minutes, get to know the individual, get to understand a little bit about, if it's, let's say, somebody individually who wants to pursue sales training, what are their goals? Like I mentioned, I like to have people come check out training early on in the process, because again, if they don't align with Sandler methodology or they don't really get a connection to the trainer, it doesn't make a difference as to how much pain they have how much they're willing and able to invest, when they're looking to start the training. So I like to bring that to the beginning of the sales process. I also find that when they're on training, that's a good opportunity to create a little bit more rapport. And then from there, if they get the sense that this is something they want to pursue further, now we can have a deeper discussion. What are their objectives? What is it that they want to achieve? I always like to say, well, let's fast forward. Let's pretend you finished the training and you reflect back. How will you know that it's a good investment of your time and money? And so once we've gone through that process, that at that point we decide whether or not it makes sense to move forward. Now, one other thing I may do is if they're not quite sure what they want to accomplish, or they're not quite sure, like for example, if it's a sales leader or they don't know too much about their team, we may introduce assessments also as a way to figure out what are the gaps. But I think it's important for me, an ideal sales process is when we have a good understanding of the objectives that our clients are trying to hit. We get a lot of times where the person will say, well, our sales team came to us and they said that they want more training. And so that's why we're reaching out. And then with a couple of questions of asking, well, what do you want to accomplish? Well, yeah, we just need to get better at sales. Okay, great. Help me understand what better means. Well, just close more. That isn't ideal for us, because if we don't have good objectives, then it's going to be really hard to justify the investment.
I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. Listeners can check out the other podcasts about how to succeed with trials and demos. There's one with Hamish Knox there that's really good. Also, what you said about, defining the process. The other thing that came to mind for me was the length of time. So this could be done in one day, could be done in 6 weeks or 6 months. I think a lot of people struggle with the difference between a sales methodology, like the Sandler system of what you're trying to accomplish, the sales process of like how you're going to accomplish it and what you need to do along the way. And then also that whole like buying process and the sales cycle, which could be a one-call close, or it could be an enterprise sale with a whole bunch of meetings and different conferences and modalities and virtual meetings and live meetings and on-site demos or software trials that last 30 days and all kinds of stuff. I think it's important to separate those out as separate things. I think that really came to mind for me there too. One last question for you. Do you have a favorite quote, motto, or Sandler rule that comes to mind today?
I think that probably the one that's most fitting, and then there's so many great Sandler rules. In fact, the Sandler rules for sales, Sandler rules for sales leaders, among two of my favorite books. I think for today, the one that I really am focusing on is avoid mutual mystification. Avoid mutual mystification. So if you as the seller are unaware of your buyer's process or whether or not they've made the buying decision, then you are headed down a path that could get you to that place of doing the perpetual follow-up. And if you are on the buyer's side, if you don't really understand how to buy what the salesperson is selling, again, you may just default to a process where it's not in your best interest. So I would say avoid mutual mystification.
I like it. All right, Dave, let's match it up. All right, Dave, let's wrap it up for everybody with the three quick ones. What is one attitude you'd like people to have leaving the podcast?
So your goal as a selling professional is to help your buyer make the best informed decision possible, whether that is to go with your solution, whether it's to go with a competitor, or whether it's to do nothing at all.
And one key behavior or action item you would like people to do?
Create your sales template, create that step-by-step process. Don't be afraid to go back and refine it. Again, the sales process has to be mutually beneficial for both parties.
And finally, the best technique, tool, or hack to use?
Macro upfront contract. So once you have that process, we spend so much time trying to understand our buyer's process. I think it's equally important to let them know what is the process that your most successful clients go through when making the decision to do business with you.
I love it. That's David Fisher from Manhattan, a longtime Sandler trainer. You can find our other Sandler trainers at Sandler.com as well, or reach out to our enterprise sales team if you have multi-state and multi-location businesses. As always, you can subscribe to this podcast, leave us a review, or share it with somebody that you think needs to hear it in the sales profession. And thank you for listening. Remember, whatever you are, be a good one. The How to Succeed podcast is brought to you by Sandler, the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training with over 200 locations. For more information, visit Sandler.com.
The Sandler Summit returns in 2023. Each new event builds exponentially upon the energy and success of the prior year. The 2022 Sandler Summit event was a huge success for everyone who attended, so don't miss the next one. Buy your tickets to the Sandler Summit at Sandler.com/summit.